Okay, so good morning, everyone. So many people here this morning. Before I introduce our guest this morning, there's just a few housekeeping rules, which are basic. Mobile phones, could you please turn them off? This is because we are web streaming and recording this lecture this morning. And because of the recording, we also have microphones, so there is time for questions at the end. Please wait for the microphone when you have your questions so that we get everybody recorded, please. So it's my great pleasure this morning to introduce you to Mark Klett. Mark is a photographer who has been photographing the intersection of cultures, landscapes, and time for the past 35 years. Originally with a background in geology, Mark has been the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Ball Foundation, the Japan-US Friendship Commission in particular, where he found himself photographing the Kobe earthquake in 1995. A lot of things, basically. His work has been exhibited and published both nationally and internationally, and his work is held in over 80 museum collections worldwide. He's the author of 13 books, including Saguaros, After the Ruins, Yosemite in Time, Third View, Second Sights, and his most recent book with frequent collaborator Byron Wolfe, which is called Reconstructing the View. Currently, he's Regents Professor of Art at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona, and he very kindly agreed to fly a very long way, halfway around the world, to come here this morning to Izmir to share his work and his experiences with you all, and conduct a 4-day workshop with our students here in the process, of which I'll talk about a little bit at the end. So with no further ado, please give a warm applause for Mark Klett.
Okay, well thank you, and thank you for being here and inviting me to be in Izmir. And I'm still a little bit jet-lagged, so I hope that I'll be coherent this morning. But I'm going to show you several projects, and actually I was going to say, because it's so small, I mean we could just have questions if people want to ask questions. Just feel free when I'm talking. I'm going to do this very informally, so if you have a question, just ask, and I'll see what I can do to answer it. I'm primarily a landscape photographer, but and I'm going to talk about time and place, but I'm going to start in a very unusual place for a landscape photographer and show you some portraits to begin. Can we bring the lights down, or should we do that? So you can see better. I'm going to begin with this series of, or maybe these, is that? Yeah, that's good. Okay, good. Thank you. Actually, you know, I'm not concerned with you seeing me, but I guess you are. So I'd rather hide here, but that's okay. Is that? Can you see it? Okay. I guess you're going to have to. Okay. I'm going to begin with something unusual, which is what I call birthday portraits, and let me explain this. This is a photograph of my daughter Lena and me. Lena was born on my 39th birthday, so we share a birthday. And once a year, we make a picture in the backyard of her and I. So this is the first one. Lena's 1, and I'm 40. So every year, we perform this ritual in the backyard. And now she's 2, and I'm 41. And I'm going to stop having birthdays now, so it's just Lena's birthday at this point. So she's 3. And you can see there's quite a bit of change. Every year, this is only 1 year difference, so it's an exact span of time. And here she's 4. I think she's changing quite quickly, and I'm trying to stay the same as much as possible. And here she's 5. So the point for me is that I think even though the span of time is the same, the way we experience time is different. So I think a year for her is a tremendously large amount of time, and she's experiencing new things, and things are different every year for her. She's 6. But for me, a year is actually getting shorter and shorter. I think it's less much time every year. I think, wow, that year went by so fast. I can't believe it. Here she's 7. Here she's 8. So even though the time span is the same, the duration of time, the experience of time is different. And that's part of what my interest is. How do we experience time? And how do we record it? How do we understand it? What are the markers that we use to understand time? She's 9. And here she's 10. This is an example of photography that deals with a duration of time, but not a place. Even though the place is the same, things are not constant when it comes to the location. She's 11. She's 12. I think you can see there's a little different look in her face now. And she's 13 here. She's starting to be a teenager. And then there's this one here. You can see there's more of a distance there between us. This is teenage, you can maybe relate to this. And here she's 15. So part of the idea here to me is the experience of each of us is very different. But the duration is the same. And how do we begin to mark that? She's 15. She's 16. And this is a very common idea. I begin with this idea of snapshots, really, because although these are a little bit more deliberate than most snapshots, that you can understand this idea of going back over time in the same place. Is it 17? I can't, yeah. Is it 18? 19? 20? 21. This was last year. She's 21, I'm 60. The thing is that she's been changing very rapidly. There will come a time when she's changing less and I'm changing more, and this situation will reverse and will become completely different. But this is a way to understand something about how we measure time. We don't measure it by the clock. We measure it by experience. And we measure it by things that relate to who we are and actually where we are. So as an introduction, I wanted to show you that, because now I switch to landscape. But for me, the idea is the same. It's the idea of measuring time in duration. So now I go back early in my career to a project called the Rephotographic Survey Project that began in 1977. And this was my introduction to landscape photography as well, and the idea of going back to a place over time. So here's a photograph that was taken in 1872 by the photographer Timothy O'Sullivan in the western United States at a place called Green River, Wyoming, of 2 rocks that the photographers were photographing for surveys of the American West at that time to show people in the East Coast back in Washington what there was back in the western states. So we took a picture like this, which had a great deal of historic significance, and we decided to find out where that was taken and make a new picture. And you see that here. And so this is the same place. It's now in the city of Green River, Wyoming. And you can see there's a house that's been built because the city's grown out to the location of where that picture was made. And there's a bus in the view. And there's a tree growing up covering part of the view. So there's been quite a bit of change here in this location. And all we could do in the days when we did this is we could make pictures that we could show the first picture on the left and the new picture on the right, and we would put a frame around it. And this was the result. Then and now. Some people say, I really don't like those terms, then and now. Some people call it then and now photography, because when was then and when is now? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But we know that was 1872 and that was 1979. So we began to make pictures using these historic photographs of the American West and making pictures from the same vantage point. And we tried to be very precise about finding the exact location of where these pictures were made. And by that, I mean to get within a very small range of error to be exactly in the same spot. And here you can see a picture that O'Sullivan made in 1869 of Virginia City, Nevada, that's now an open pit mine where they're looking for gold, basically. At one time they had many little mines, but now they made it into one big strip mine. So one of the biggest changes we saw, and what this did was allowed us to talk about change, what's happened in the West in this period of time, 100, 110 years, 120 years. And we can see now that there's still certain things like mining. Another change that happened was urbanization. So this is a place, Salt Lake City, Utah, which you can see on the right, but it was a very small town on the left, just a bunch of tents that were just people beginning to settle there. So urbanization was one of the big changes. Another big change had to do with water. So here you see there's a reservoir. There was at one time a river. They built a dam. They created a reservoir. So now it's this big lake that's filled up. And the biggest change that we see in the American West actually has to do with water. It's a very dry region, and nobody could live there until they began to do something about water. They transport water, they store water, they create ways for water to come into the urban areas and create the ability to live there. So those are the biggest changes. That project took 4 years to finish, and we published a book in 1984 called Second View, the Rephotographic Survey. And I thought at that time that was the last time I would make rephotographs. I took a lot of work, and I thought this was a lot, too much work. I'm never going to do this again, and I'm glad it's done. And that's the end. But 20 years later, I thought maybe it would be interesting to actually look at these places once again in the late 1990s. So I created a project called Third View, and these were the people that were involved in the project Third View, including Byron Wolf, who you'll see a little bit later come back in the project. And what we decided to do was go back to these places we first rephotographed in the 1970s and look at them again and create a third view. But what made this project different actually was that we created not just prints then and now sort of prints, we created an electronic product that was an interactive DVD. I'm actually not going to show you the DVD because it requires, at this point, I have to move to Windows software. So in order to make this flow a little better on this computer, I'm just going to show you a little video that demonstrates some of the features, one of the main features of this interactive DVD. So you're seeing here a map of the American West, and I'm rolling over hotspots. There's one at Green River. So I'll click on that, and it brings me to Green River. There's a series of choices here. It'll bring me to that one picture I just showed you. And here's the way we saw it before. The first view, we can click on now the second view. And this is all done on a computer screen, of course. So now we can go to, it'll dissolve into the second view. And then we can go to the third view at the same location. So we're going back again and remaking the view another time. So instead of 1979, we're doing it in 1997. And the view now looks like this. Not a whole lot of change. Most of the change happened in the first 100 years. But now, because we're doing this on computer, we can do something that we couldn't do before. Now we can start using color. So we can turn the color on and see it in color. We can go back to the first view, and we can see the O'Sullivan photograph again. And we can dissolve back and forth between the first, second, and third views. But going back to the first one, we created this thing called the time reveal window. We click on this, and it creates a little window. We can move around, and you're looking through time. You're looking at 1997 over top of 1872. So a little window gives you a little way to move it around and physically look at the relationship of one layered on top of the other. And again, I mean, if I could do this the way it should be done, you would be the driver and you would do this yourself, and you could play with this and see. We can do it 1997 over top of 1979. You can change the layers. We also have a magnifying glass, and you can see it better on the screen. You probably can't see it in projection very well, but there's two bottles in the window. There's one there and one there in the window. Turn on the third view, and the bottles are still there 20 years later. Well, some things never change. So this is like a little demo of what we can do now electronically, and there's so much more to this DVD, and I may show some in the workshop that we have, because this DVD also includes videos and sound and oral history interviews and all kinds of things we couldn't do with just dealing with prints. So we're really trying to develop the context around the view so you can understand not just the physical changes that happened in this place, but actually what the context was for the changes and why it changed and who's involved and stuff like that. But I'm going to move on now to some other projects, because I really want to talk about, in this talk, methods and ways of looking at historic images, and the ways that in the projects that I've been involved with, how things have evolved, how the methods have evolved. Now, this is a project that involves an urban area after the ruins, 1906 and 2006. And it's the city of San Francisco. In 1906, there was a major earthquake in San Francisco, and it destroyed a third of the city. And the city was burned by fire and destroyed, not unlike here in Izmir, actually, when you had a fire as well. But the project began with the same idea of making a rephotograph. On this side, here on the left, you see a photograph taken of the city after the earthquake and fire in 1906, and it shows the destruction. So you're really looking at ruins there, looking down Market Street, which is one of the main streets in the city, but on either side is just the ruins of buildings. So I can find this location, it's actually in a clock tower, and I can go back and I can make a view from the same location, which looks like this. And so you can see now how the buildings have been built up. But it wasn't very satisfying, because the original photographer used a fairly long lens, and using the same lens that he used and cropping the same way, I'm not getting the top of the building. So I thought, well, why don't I just use a longer lens here, and now you can see more of the city. It's actually made from the same location, but it's made with a wider angle lens. And now that window that's drawn, the rectangle, shows you the cropping of the original image, which I later left out the window. But you get the idea that even though the view is bigger, it's made from the same location. Another thing I did here, instead of using the old picture on the left and the new picture on the right, I decided to flip these like that. Because in most Western cultures, we read from left to right. And normally we think that the picture on the left came first. But in this case, I wanted to confuse the viewer a little bit, because what happens is the view of the uninterrupted city is on the left, but the view of destruction is on the right. And normally we think that's the normal course of events, that the world goes from order to chaos. And in fact, though, that's reversed. And the message there is essentially that this can happen again, and it will happen again, because San Francisco is a city that's going to experience earthquakes in the future. So here's a series of pictures, and what happened in the city was that there was a lot of buildings that were constructed on the same footprint as the original building. So you see here, that was the Hearst building, and they've rebuilt the Hearst building, and it's on the same footprint, so the building looks fairly similar, even though it's not the same building. In some cases, here, there's a monument, and the monument was not ruined, and they stayed in the same place, but you can see that the building was built around it. And it's kind of confusing, because you would normally think that this picture on the left came first and this destruction came afterwards. This is the street corner of Powell and, actually I forget the other street, the cross street, but it's in the picture on the right, that building that you see with the top, it was the tallest building in San Francisco at that time, called the Call Building, and the building is still there. You can see it in the same location, but it has a different top, and they've created a different facade on the building. They made it an Art Deco facade in the 1930s. And the man who was standing on that light post, it was not uncommon in that time for people, when they knew the fire was approaching their houses, they would put on their best clothing. So people were often dressed in very formally with suits, because that was their best clothing. They wanted to save it from the fire. So he's leaning up against a charred light post, and there's a woman sort of looking at me from across the street at the similar location. And this one was in the financial district. The building that you see on the right is what was called the coal building. And you can still see it. It's, I don't know if you can make it out. It's the smaller building now in the sort of off to the side. Can you see this location? Here, yeah. So that building survived, and they rehabbed it on the inside to make the same building. But now all the buildings around it are much larger. So I like this. In the early photograph, people are walking down the street away from the camera, looking at the ruins. And here you see the taxi cabs, and they're going the same direction. But the cab has a placard on top of the cab, and it says, "This way to your future." And I think that was really part of the message, was that even though you think it's over, it's really not over, because it's going to happen again at some time. This is outside the city, and it's actually, you see there on the right, the crack of the fault itself, and that actually broke the ground. And now a tree has grown in the same spot, an oak tree. And it looks like it's all covered over. But if you were to dig a trench there, which some geologists did not too long ago, you dig down and you see the fault again. It's still there. It's just hidden by it all. Okay. So in that case, in photographing cities, one of the things, and you can find that here in Izmir as well, is that in most landscape views, you're looking for things that have changed, little small details of things that have changed. But in cities, you're looking for the one thing that's staying the same, because the cities change so rapidly that things, 100 years is just a huge amount of time, and things are, quite different. I'm going to stay with San Francisco in another project here, a panorama I made of San Francisco based on a prior panorama of San Francisco. And I know you can't see this very well, but I wanted to show you the dimensions of this panorama. It was a panorama made in 1878 by Edward Muybridge, the photographer. And he made it by creating 13 separate panels and then putting them together to give you the illusion of a continuous panorama. And so what I did was I went back to the same location and made a new panorama. And I'll zoom in here a little bit so you can see some relative panels. And I was able to get the same information left to right on each picture, but I'm much higher than Muybridge when he made his picture, because Muybridge was at the tallest building in San Francisco at that time, which was the Mark Hopkins residence, and now it's the Mark Hopkins Intercontinental Hotel. And I had to be on top of the hotel, so it's much higher. But left to right, I'm getting the same information, and you can see just the dramatic nature of the change in cities. And here you see that there's actually virtually nothing that's the same, because everything was destroyed by the fire, and now it's been rebuilt. So we can move around a little bit and look. I think in this panorama, I don't think I found a single building that was the same between 1878 and this was done in 1990, so it's been a while. But there was nothing that I could see that survived, and everything was completely changed. The streets, of course, were in the same location, and you can see the background, the islands and the hills and stuff are the same, of course. But the city itself was completely made over once again. Very similar to what's happened here, actually, in many parts of the city. And we're looking past the financial district now, more towards the south. And I want to point out something now about how this panorama was made. Muybridge in 1878 could not take a panorama. There was no panorama cameras in those times. What he had to do was take 13 separate pictures. He would trim off the edges a little bit and then butt them up against one another so they would line up and give you the sense of a continuous panorama. And what he did is he started in the morning, photographing towards the southwest, so the sun was behind him. And then he moved to the west, to the northwest, to the north. And as he did that, the sun moved around, so it was always at his back. And it took him a certain amount of time to make every picture, because he had to coat every plate of glass, sensitize it, expose it, and develop it while it was still wet. And he did this on a very large piece of glass. So it was a real technical feat. It was really something that took a lot of effort to do and a lot of expertise. And it was very methodical, but there was a part of the panorama that I found very instructive. And it's this sequence right here in the middle of the panorama. If you notice carefully, you'll notice that the picture in the middle is different. And it's because the lighting is different. On the two end panels, the lighting is coming from this direction. But the panel in the middle, the lighting is coming from this direction. And that's because it's made out of sequence. The ones on the end were made in the morning. The one in the middle was made in the afternoon. Why did he make that one out of sequence? There's no way to tell. There's no record of it. And unless you look at the panorama carefully, you don't notice it. But I thought it was really interesting because what he essentially is doing with this is he's creating a map of a place, making photographs. And the photographs become like a template. And any picture that you make can be redone at any time. That's what the lesson is. So if you go back to that same spot, you can replace the panel, which is what I did. Now, obviously, I'm different height here, so that's a difference in the way it looks. But the concept is the same, that once you've created a map of space, you can go back to that space and replace pieces of that map and do it at different times. So it's the relationship between time and place that I found very instructive. And I learned a lesson from him in doing this. So my panorama looks like this, but it's really based on his map. It's based on the map that he created by his photography. Moving to the next project, we used this idea to create pictures in this project in Yosemite National Park in California. This is a project I did with Byron Wolf, my colleague in photography, and the writer Rebecca Solnit. We published a book called Yosemite in Time. It began simply enough with this same idea, this photograph by Edward Muybridge of the Yosemite Valley, and then this photograph is the repeat of that. And you can see it's completely different because now the trees have grown in because they've stopped the forest fires that go through there. So we began with the same idea of finding the location of the original photograph and then trying to make new pictures. But then we started to think about what are we really finding and how can we change the methods a little bit using some of the same ideas that we learned from Muybridge. So here you see a rephotograph, Muybridge on the left and our picture on the right, which is the same location. But what fascinated us here was we could actually look at these trees. There's 130-something years between the two pictures, but some of the trees are the same. So we could identify certain trees here that were the same as we found in our picture. So these are our trees put on top of Muybridge's view, using his view as a map. So basically, we can take those trees and place them onto our picture. We know then that actually we could actually create a view that looked like this or like that, and that represents the constants in the view. Those things are constant, you know, that even though we expect them not to be because they're living things. So we started to play a little bit with the idea of the methods, knowing what we had was a sort of template idea for a map. Another thing we discovered, which was a little bit unexpected, was there was a picture that Muybridge made here above Lake Tenaya called Glacier-Worn Granites. And it shows the polish of the stone because the glaciers went across and polished the stone. And we didn't know that this picture was related to this picture by the photographer Edward Weston, made in 1938. Weston's a very famous photographer of the modernist period. And he made this picture of this juniper. And we realized that this juniper was probably still alive because this juniper is probably hundreds of years old. So we were able to find this juniper and actually place it into a view and create a panorama in which we went from the Weston walking several hundred meters until we finally connected to the Muybridge. And we're using stones and the background. The background is continuous, and we're using rocks and stuff in the foreground to give some continuity to the picture until we get to the Muybridge here. So in the end, we end up with a panorama that looks like this, that connects the Weston to the Muybridge. So it's one continuous space, but we can walk around the space and connect these two pictures. So this begins to define certain areas of interest that I have, because a place like Yosemite as a national park is a place that we call a place of high image density. There's lots and lots of pictures that were made there. If we have a place that has a lot of pictures, can we begin to connect the pictures together? Here's another example. This picture by Ansel Adams, the famous photographer, taken in about 1939 or so, 1940. This picture taken by Edward Weston a couple of years earlier, probably 1938, of Lake Tenaya. Different scene, showing the more of the lake. And then finally, this picture by Edward Muybridge in 1872, probably the first photograph of Lake Tenaya, the first photograph that was made. And we didn't know until we got there that these pictures could be connected. If we take this picture of Muybridge and we back up a little bit, we can connect it to the scene, and we can connect it to the mountains as we experience them. And that's my colleague Byron Wolf, and he's swatting the mosquitoes that were up there. They were really bad that day. And we can back up a little further, and we can begin to create a panorama of the lake in several parts. So we now extended the view that Muybridge created, but now we can see where other pictures come in. This is where the Edward Weston view fits, right there. And then this is where the Ansel Adams view fits, right there. So actually, we can map these views on top of each other, because once we have the space and we can template the space, we can create a map, we can then place pictures within that map. It doesn't mean that they're made from the same point, because they're not. These are 3 pictures made at 3 different times by 3 separate photographers who had no idea they were photographing places similar to each other. But in fact, the Muybridge view and the Weston view were only made about this far apart, really less than 1 meter apart. And the Ansel Adams view was a little bit further out there. But the fascinating thing to me is that because this is one place and there are a high image density area, we can begin to layer this image. So if you think about space, you can think about space being like layers of space. And the pictures become like almost strata and rocks. So when you lay down something, it's deposited on top of something else, it creates this layered rock. It's like same with photography. You can take it, turn it up, and pull the layers apart, and each one is a photographic piece. They're parts of the photograph, and you can reorganize the layers and place them on top of one another, because the space is fairly continuous. This kind of space doesn't change much. The pictures change. This was a little tiny plastic camera, a little toy. It was only about this big. It was really small. We found this on the shore of the lake, exactly where Weston and Muybridge stood. I thought this was a sign of a ghost right there. It was amazing. A couple of years ago, I did this project in Barcelona, created a panorama of Barcelona from a common space. And it starts with this view. This is the earliest one that the archive in Barcelona had. And it's a view in, I don't know the exact date, I think it's in 1500 something. So it's over 500 years old. This view of Barcelona from this one spot called Miramar. And so this has been a spot from which the city has been seen for over 500 years. And because of that, it has a deep history of images. So this is the earliest image of the city, the walled city. You can see the medieval city with the walls around it and the fields on the outside, the bay and the port. And over that history, within that 500 years, there's this rich visual history of drawings, engravings, prints, and then later photographs. Here's some more pictures of the city from that location. And some of these were published in books, some were prints, some were individual art objects. Some of the later ones from the 17th century, the 18th century, were drawings of the fort. Then, by the time photography came around in the late 19th century or the mid-19th century, the city was beginning to change. Here's an early photograph from Miramar showing the city. And the walls are starting to get knocked down because at that time they were removing the walls so that they could get trains and transportation in. This is very common in European cities because they were originally walled off for protection, and later the walls became impediments to transportation, so they tore them down. And this is one of the better known series of photographs by a photographer named Laurent, who photographed in the early 1870s, I believe, and a series of pictures of Barcelona as it started to grow beyond the walls. And the walls are being torn down at this point, or have been torn down. And this is a little series of looking across towards the bay and towards the port. And later on, the port was changed just in the same way that's happened here in Izmir, where they've reclaimed some of the land. What you see here in the foreground is parts of ruins that they're using to throw into the water to create more land, so they can build the land out a little bit. And we can take those 4 pictures by Laurent and actually make a panorama out of them. And you can see this more sweeping view of the city here. And again, this is all from the same area. This is from the same location, basically. Eventually, they built a restaurant up at this spot, in Miramar. So there's a restaurant there today, too. It doesn't look like this exactly, but there is still a restaurant there where you could go up and then look at the city and eat and drink. And this was another view made from that same location at the port from the restaurant in Miramar. And it swings around so you can see to the south and to the east. And the port's been reclaimed now a little bit, so it's a little bit bigger. And eventually the photographs show the industrialization of the city. This is the factory, and we can sort of step back and see that in relation to the view. And what I ended up doing was taking little parts of these views, like the factory, and then figuring out ways to embed that into a larger view. So I went to Miramar in late 2010 and made this panorama of the city from Miramar, about a 180-degree view, looking towards the north and sweeping through parts of the city. You can see some famous things like the Gaudi Sagrada Familia in the background there, and other famous landmarks in the city. And this is what it looks like pretty much now, sweeping across towards the port. And a lot of that original land has been reclaimed. And there's very little of the original city left. There's a few things that were there in the historic photographs that still remain. And now there's cruise ships in the port looking towards the south. And so what I ended up doing was taking those historic views and taking pieces of them and beginning to layer into the view. So you see little parts of historic images now, and even some pictures that I made at different times being layered into the view as little windows. So you see I'll build up more of them. So by taking this 500-year history, I was able to build into this image little pieces of history. So it's a layered image. The base image is contemporary. The rest of it is historical pictures laid on top of it. And these are the historic images just by themselves. And they form a kind of continuous piece, or they imply parts of a continuous piece. And then together they fit into that whole. So that panorama is quite large, actually. It's a little over 3 meters, and so it's big, and you can see very great detail in that. This idea was part of this next project, and this is the last thing I'm going to show you. This is a project called Reconstructing the View with Byron Wolfe, and this is a project we did that just got published last year in this book of the same name. And it's on the Grand Canyon. And Arizona, where I live, is the home to the Grand Canyon, which is a very famous location. I recommend going there if you ever get to the United States. And we began this project with historic images in the same way that we normally begin a project, looking at a picture like this by a man named William Bell, I can do research online. So most of my research now is done by cruising the internet. So in this case, I went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and I realized that there's not just one picture, but actually two pictures, and they're connected. So I can download the two pictures, and I can put them together to form a continuous picture. And then what we can do is go there and create this overview and embed these pictures into the scene. Now, this is a technique that we call embedded panoramas. So I've already showed you a little bit of this before, but it's a concept where you can take the historic image and make a larger view and embed the original images into that, so you see the context for the view within inside it. And you can see these two guys from the 19th century. There's actually two. It looks like there's three, but there's two. One of them is repeated. And then you see this camper driving out of the 19th century into the 21st century into the scene. So this idea is how we started. And here's another view of the north part of the Grand Canyon by William Bell, in which you can see 4 different views. 3 of them on the right were done from the same position, and the 4th one was done from a slightly different position. But we can put them all together to form a continuous idea of a sweeping panorama. The Grand Canyon is another place where there's a really high image density, so there's a lot of pictures at every given spot. This is a photograph in the middle, black and white this time, around it, by the photographer Frederick Sommer, a famous modernist from here in the 1940s. And we're showing how Sommer's view fits into the larger scene. This was a place that I was informed by a new idea. And this was a photograph that Ansel Adams made from a place called Yavapai Point. And Adams went to this place and spent the entire day at Yavapai Point and made a series of photographs. And I'm going to layer those pictures that he made. So here's one picture, and he made this with a wide-angle lens. So the wide-angle lens gives you a lot of space. So you're seeing like this much view. A normal lens would take in maybe this much view, and a telephoto lens would take in maybe this much view. So the difference in sizes you see here are the different lenses he used. So here's one picture he made. Here's another picture that he made with a slightly longer lens. But here, I've taken the picture and layered it over top of the space, so the space is the same. And so what I'm doing is I'm taking the pictures that he made in one day and mapping them on top of one another. So I'm putting them over top of the space that he photographed. And over the course of a day, he made 8 separate pictures. Until finally, there's this one small one there. And Ansel Adams never meant anybody to look at his pictures this way. But I'm doing it this way to show you something which I think is an interesting concept for me. This is the idea that we call mashup. In music, we know the term mashup remix. That's something that people do in music, but I think we can do it in photography as well. We can take parts that come from different things and put them together and create a new whole made from derivative parts. So in this case, this is what's happening. We're mashing up Ansel Adams into one view. That's the map of his space. We can use that concept in a piece like this. This is a mashup. And it shows Yavapai Point as one continuous space, but it's done with pieces from different time periods. So here you see the black and white images. If I zoom in, if you're looking across this, you're looking at the view almost 180 degrees from Yavapai Point. But if I zoom in, you'll see it begins with 2 pictures by Ansel Adams. Then beneath that is a picture that we made to bridge the gap between his pictures and this one that's brown, which is a gum print by a man named Alvin Langdon Coburn, made about 1911. Beneath that is a cyanotype, a blueprint made from 1903. And then on the other side of that is a picture that we made. So we can create a map of this space using other people's photographs and our own, because they all were made at the same point, in the same place, relatively speaking, the same place. Here's another mashup. In this case, a photograph of a Navajo Indian made by the Colt brothers, and it's done for tourists as a sort of souvenir photograph. He's holding a rifle, standing on top of this wall. And now there's tourists there. This guy showing off his tattoos with his girlfriend, holding his arm. It's really kind of interesting. But this is what we call a mashup of space. Now this piece is a similar piece to what I showed you in Barcelona. but it's, I think, one of the most interesting drawings of the Grand Canyon. So we can actually use drawings, too, if the drawings are accurate. So this, in this case, there's a very accurate drawing done by this man sitting here, William Holmes. And Holmes was a very good draftsman, and he was very accurately drew every layer of the Grand Canyon. So this became a very beautiful panorama, and we were trying to figure out what we could do to add something to this panorama. So we decided to add to it pieces of our own experience. We went to this place and we spent about 2 days, made about 1,000 photographs, and then later in the studio began to enter images into it. So there's a picture of the Colorado River and the base of the Grand Canyon that we put into that scene. We can add to it a early morning photograph. And these are accurate so that we can do that. There's a storm on the south rim at night. There's a sunset. Early morning view here in the foreground, and a bird flying overhead. So we can begin to piece parts of our experience into the picture that Holmes drew, and so eventually we end up with something like this. So we're only using pieces of views, parts of views that fit into one another. And what was significant to us about doing this was that the Holmes view drew the canyon as if the lighting was always even and universal. And we were trying to depict lighting that was very specific to the moment that we were experiencing the canyon. Sunset, sunrise, early morning, and the beauty of the color, the beauty of the light. So embedding those two things together, I think, gives a very different sense of what's happening at this place. One is a very 19th century view. The other, I think, is a more 21st century view of the place. We got to the point that we stopped rephotographing precisely, but instead began to respond to earlier pictures. So this is a photograph by Edward Weston of the storm above Vermilion Cliffs. And we went back and made a picture just to the right of his. Now it's the Exxon station. And the final piece is really that, left and right. We have a storm, he has a storm. And so in a sense, what we're really doing here is making the early photographers unwitting collaborators to our process. So now we collaborate with them. They don't know that, of course, but we're making them collaborators. So we have an image that responds to the earlier image, not just repeats it, but actually makes a statement about it. Here, this is the painter, Arthur Wesley Dow, very carefully crawling up to the edge of the Grand Canyon and laying his camera down there because he's afraid he might fall over the edge. And we back up a little bit. And we see the Park Service very graciously provided that railing so you wouldn't fall in. I think the lady with the crutches really needed that, actually. So very careful on the edge there. So this became the case where we began to respond to the pictures, not simply repeat them. But it still depends on being in the same place, and that's the important part, because we have to do this from the same location. Here, this is a half of a stereo view of the painter Thomas Moran, very famous American landscape painter, helped to popularize the Grand Canyon. In fact, his pictures were used to teach people how to even see the Grand Canyon. We can back up, we can connect the view to what Moran was actually seeing using those rocks that you see. The rocks are continuous from one image to the next. And he has his hat sitting next to him, and that's Byron's hat sitting next to us. And as we're taking the picture, a bird flies overhead. And I pull out my digital camera here, and I make this picture of the bird flying overhead. And we can actually embed it into the view because we have part of the trees and we have a little bit of the north rim, and so we can actually take that picture and put it into the view, and it makes it more complete now, I think. But then we started looking at the bird more close up, and the bird actually has a tag, an orange tag right there. And if I could blow that up further, it has a number because these birds are endangered species and they're reintroduced to the canyon, and they number them. And this one is number 302. And it was hatched in Boise, Idaho in 2003, and we know when it was released. So we can actually track that bird, and I like this idea because in some ways this is an environmental issue. It takes the issue of the environment and how to preserve the environment and brings it all the way back to Thomas Moran, who was the artist who began to popularize the canyon and teach people how to view it. So we can begin to connect the histories of these two things, the present-day history to the past history. We also began to think about how we can do multimedia work here. This is a postcard that we found in the Grand Canyon. It's kind of very a nondescript view, actually, just as general view of the Grand Canyon. But this person wrote on top of it, "My brother in Phoenix died April 27th, didn't get to go." Well, that was a very sad message. You know, the brother didn't get to make it. So what we did was we went back to this place and we made a video from the same location. And it just takes less than a minute. It's fairly short, but you can see that it was windy that day and the clouds were moving pretty quickly, and there was this one cloud that started to move over. And at the very end of this, something really kind of beautiful happens. And I just won't say anything more. I'll just let you watch to the end. And then it fades back to the postcard again. So we thought that was the homage to the brother. So, you know. So we think about the idea of manipulating the view too, in terms of not just still images, but video images. And then we were also interested in the idea of stereo views, because a lot of the first pictures of the Grand Canyon were done in stereo. It was a very popular way of looking at American landscape, any landscapes here in Europe and all over the world, really. People looked at stereo views in the late 19th century, and we thought it might be really interesting. This was a stereo view made in 1872 of a place called Perched Rock, and we thought it might be really interesting to go back and try to insert ourselves into the view. So we did. This is Byron walking into the view, and he wants to see what this guy's looking at. So we go over to this guy, and he looks down. Can't really figure it out, so he just walks on behind the rock. So this was where we started to get really playful with the view too, and I hope you can understand that we're thinking when we're doing this kind of work that if we're not having fun, it's not worth doing. So I think a lot of this is about enjoying it. And this, by the way, was made for an iPad. So I had this special stereo viewer created, so you put the iPad there and you look through the viewer and you can see it in stereo, and it works really well. It's a great stereo. I can't show it to you in stereo, but this looks really good. We started to think about not just about the photography, again, and what's changed and stuff, but how photography as a medium has to make you see something. And we ran across this thing, and you've seen these. We saw one yesterday at that overview. You put money into it, and then you turn it, and for a certain amount of time, you can see something. And in this case, it's $0.25. We call it a quarter. So we tried it. And the thing says camera fans. This is a quality instrument. You can make pictures through it. So we said, let's see what we can do. So we started to look through it, and you see stuff like this. This is a view from inside it. We would frame it. I would frame it. Byron would put his little camera up to it and take a picture. And so we started to make photographs. And this is what we ended up with. And the final piece looks like this. This was all the views we could get for $1 before the time ran out. So and these are laid out in a spatial order. So they actually are laid out relative to the actual space. So if you were to look at the Grand Canyon that way, that's all you would see. And we weren't content with that idea, so we did this. I found this incredible instrument. This is an artillery spotting scope that they use for the military. And I found it on eBay. So I bought this thing. I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but I thought it was cool. So we took it out to the Grand Canyon, and we're looking through it, and it's really great. I mean, you see things really well through this thing. And you look through it, and we took it to this place right here. This is another Holmes drawing of what's called Marble Canyon from the Kaibab Plateau. And we found where we think Holmes sat when he made that drawing. There's a platform. And we're really sure that Holmes sat exactly at this point when he made that drawing. So we went there, And we sat there and we spent 2 days there. And there's Byron with a computer and I'm sitting there on the right. And in between us is the instrument. And so naturally we looked through the instrument and made pictures. And you see, here's a picture we made through the instrument. And it has lines because the military guys use that to determine where to tell them to aim the artillery shells. So we took pictures through that, and then we started to embed those into the scene. So this is another embedded panorama that you see here. It's like bubbles in the landscape. So these are the views that we found were significant, embedded into the larger view. And of course we had to draw ourselves into the picture. So we added to his drawing and put ourselves into the view as well. Eventually we got to the point that we didn't actually need to even create pictures. We could use other people's pictures to create the image of the Grand Canyon. And these are historic photographs that were used for stereo views. They're 1/2 of a photograph for stereo views in the early 20th century. And every time somebody made a picture of the Grand Canyon, they put a person in the view because they needed scale. They needed somebody to humanize the view. So I put this together, even though these were not meant to go together, I could sort of form a continuous landscape by putting horizons together or rocks together or something like that. And you see this incredible number of different kinds of people. Here's a woman with a rifle and binoculars, people standing on ledges, there's cowboys, there's a woman throwing a rock down below. There's a kid with a sombrero from Mexico, I guess you think, and a cowboy with chaps. There's a guy holding on to a bush like he's afraid he's going to fall over. He's got knickers on. And this just goes on and on. You see these people. So this is kind of a form of a continuous, fictitious landscape. There's these guys having a meeting, you know. They're dressed in suits. One of them's actually became the president of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt. And the guy with it. And so this just keeps going and going and going. In fact, the final piece is here. And this is a little bit bigger than 3 meters long. And it's just a continuous landscape. But it's totally fictitious. And part of the idea for us was that the pictures already exist. We can begin to put them together. But I think it's much more about how people were visualizing, seeing the landscape. And then finally, at the end of the project, I'll show you one last piece that we did, 2 last pieces. This was, we started to search for photographs of the Grand Canyon, and we went to social networking sites like Flickr. And we started to download images from Flickr, and these were images that were Creative Commons licensed, so we were allowed to take them and use them. But there were just literally thousands of them. And this is a piece that is 100 sunsets on the Grand Canyon based on 100 photographs from Flickr, in which we created a common horizon. And they're sorted by color, the warmer, redder ones on the left and the cooler ones on the right. And the shape of the image depends on the size of the sun and how much there was top to bottom on the image. So that's a kind of another form of mapping there of the history of part of the history of images. And then finally, the last one I'll show you is this piece where Byron had a friend of his who was a mathematician, and we asked him to write a program for us in the computer. We started by using a robot to search the web and download the first 1,000 photographs using the words Grand Canyon. And so this is what the robot downloaded with these 1,000 photographs. This is 1,000 photographs of the Grand Canyon. We went through them. We only threw out the ones that really weren't of the Grand Canyon. Some of them were some other place. But this is the first 1,000 photographs that came up from the web using that search mechanism. Then we asked the mathematician to analyze this using software, all the colors of this image, and then take that and analyze every pixel of this image and sort it into colors. So in the end, by sorting it, we come up with this. This is what the pixel sort is of the Grand Canyon. So it actually looks a little bit like the colors you really see on the Grand Canyon. So this is what, if you take it all and you kind of put it into a digital blender and it gets all beat up and blended up and you end up with this is what you end up with, is this image. So I'm going to end with that, and that was the end of that project. But I showed you an awful lot, so I hope there was, you got something out of that. So thanks for listening. Okay. Yeah. So, if there are questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
I think that's, yeah, that's working. Okay, so are there any questions for Mark? Julia.
Is it working? Yes. Thank you very much. I'm just wondering how Rephotography project affected your relationship to time.
Well, that's a good question. It's affected my relation very much so. And I have a whole lot of other projects that I'm not showing you that were not based on rephotography per se, but that are about time. And so one of the things that that's happened to me personally in thinking about time was that when we were doing the Yosemite project, I said to Byron, you know, I have something to confess to you. I think this is going to sound really weird, but when I go back to these places, when I first went there, like the first project, the Rephotographic Survey, and I'm standing where O'Sullivan stood, I think, this is great, this is really cool. I'm standing exactly where O'Sullivan stood, and I almost imagine him as a ghost. You know, he's there, his camera, my camera, his camera, they're together in time, you know, and I thought this was really cool. But then when I went back another time, when I went back the second time, I had this strange feeling, and I said, there's something weird, because I don't think this is the same place that I was at 20 years ago. I don't think it's the same place. This is a joke, you know, somebody's like tricked us, you know, this is not the same place. And he wasn't put off by that, and he said, oh, that's interesting. Well, you should read this book by this Welsh physicist named Julian Barber, and he wrote a book called The End of Time. And Barber wrote in this book that he believes, from the point of view of physics anyway, that time doesn't exist, that time is a construction that we create. And so from that point of view, like every moment in time has and always will exist. So this moment has always existed. And in fact, any variation of this moment has existed. And this moment happens, and the only reason why I don't right now move over there or something, in some other world I do that. But in this one I haven't, because it's probability or statistics that I won't do that. And so any idea that you know, this morning when I woke up and I had breakfast with you, that is the same time as now is just something we construct, because we can't live our lives without doing that. But actually, the moment you were born, the moment you die, this moment has and always will exist. And it's a very interesting idea. And I started to think that he was right, and that photography is a perfect medium for exploring time, because we take a picture and it's about a moment. And when Barber talks about time, he says time is really a series of what he calls nows. Here's a now, then another now, and another now. And I'm thinking, as a photographer, for me, time exists as moments, because usually they're 125th of a second, or you know, a quarter of a second. I set the exposure right on the camera, and that's what the moment is. But I'm starting to think about, well, if a moment is, how long is a moment? I mean, how do you define time? Could a moment be a year? I mean, could a moment be an extension of an experience? And I think the photography is a very good medium to explore that idea. I mean, how do you begin to define moments? Throughout the history of photography, photographers have always tried to make shorter exposures. I mean, how we can stop a bullet in the air, you know, with a strobe light. But I think it's more interesting to make longer exposures. So there are some people, Michael Wesley, for example, the German photographer who makes exposures that are 2 or 3 years long, each exposure. You know, and so I think that photography can do a lot of different things. It can shorten time. It can, and you know, you can also take photographs, like say to take the pictures of my daughter and me. That's an order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But you could actually take them and switch them around, move them around. You could do 20, 6, 8, 5. You know, you could change that order. And that's the beauty of photography, that you can reorganize things. And so other projects I'm working on, I'm working with that. So I'm thinking about, how does time function? How do we think of time? How do we measure it? So rephotography is really only one small part of the things that I try to work on. So rephotography is one thing where space and time become constant, and you can play with things a little bit. But other projects, I completely change that and work in very different and more free ways. So yeah, it has changed quite a bit, my thinking about time. Now, Gary mentioned that I started in geology, so I was trained as a geologist. And when I look at landscapes, I tend to look at them in terms of time. Like, these things took a long time, you know, far more than we can even begin to understand. So it's that out of human experience that does interest me. That was a long answer, but I hope that's okay.
Thank you very much. It was really fascinating.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mark? Anybody? Okay.
Well, thank you, first of all. Very inspiring. I guess it's not a question, it's more of a comment, and from the point of, it might be the only one in architecture, or maybe a few others. From the point of view of an architect, and it's more about the concept of place making, and that's something that I am personally interested in.
Yeah.
And your photographs and the way you see photography, it's very inspiring to think about it, and the vocabulary in search of how do you make a place. We forget that time, it's such an important component in it. And when you say longer exposure, it makes me think about, how do you design a space for longer exposure?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I'm definitely very inspired by your words, and I wanted to hear more about your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. And you know, that's an interesting point, because a lot of architects study Yifu Tuan. Maybe you did when you were in school, and his thinking about landscape is really critical, I think. And he talks about creating place, and creating place usually involves memory. So that there needs to be, the difference between space, which is just out there, space, and place is that you've lived it, you've experienced it, and you've had memory of that place. And that's what makes it into a place, is that memory. So I think using historic photographs is a way to create memory. Or, if I come to a place like this and I don't know anything about this city, I can learn something from it by looking at the photographs. And even if you've been here all your life, I think you learn from the history of it, because you realize that you're not isolated in time, like this is just this one moment, but there was another time that was before you, or different times that you can relate to, because you can see what happened to those places. And so you become part of a longer dialogue, where you're in a conversation with people from different times. Then it's easy to think about the future too. I mean, what's going to happen, in the future, because you're part of that extended dialogue, and it changes your thinking about, where you are. So that's a great point, I think. Yeah. Okay.
Marina has a question.
Hi, thank you. I'm Marina from Visual Communication Design Department. I have a question about how important is for you the human figure, the human presence in understanding the topography of a place.
Yeah, I think the human figure is really important, and when I make my own photographs, not just rephotographs, but photographs that I make, I'm very conscious of the use of a figure. Sometimes when I don't have somebody else, then I put myself in the picture, or even just a shadow or something, because I think what happens in that one constructed view, I was trying to illustrate a little bit about that the reason why people put human beings in landscapes is that it allows the viewer to kind of enter the scene. And I think if you're looking just at the landscape, many times it's like looking through a window, and you don't feel connected to it. It's there and you're here, and there's no way to kind of make this connection between the place.
It sort of enhances the dialogue between the viewer and...
Yeah. But having the figure allows, the figure in a way becomes the surrogate, for the person. And when you look at it, you can understand it humanizes it and allows you to enter the scene as well. But with that, there's so many different things about the use of the figure. How is the figure used? What, you're seeing all of the figure. Is the figure small? Is it big? Sometimes, and I think there's a really good academic study to be done on this sometime. You look at the history of images, and sometimes the figures are like this, and they're especially in the American West, and they're like, we're in control here. We're going to do something with this, and we're the boss. We're going to take this over. And sometimes they're little tiny figures, and you like, this big landscape, and you feel like they're being dwarfed, and the landscape's going to take them over. Each one has a very different emotional point of view. And so I think how the figure is used, the dynamics, the body language, everything is really, really important. So in using that figure, it's a way of understanding your relationship to that place and then conveying that to the viewer. So I think it's very important. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. I actually have 3 questions. One of them I will keep it for later about Flickr because it's going to take long. Because that was what I was going to ask, but we're going to talk about later, hopefully. The 2 things I want to ask is there a specific interval you think that makes rephotography? I mean, repeating the photography
is there a specific
every interval?
Interval?
Yeah.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
what makes it rephotography if I take it every 5 years or if I take it every second?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I don't know if there isn't any specific interval. I think what it boils down to for me is what happens in between, because I think a lot of rephotography, you have this, but actually what it's about is this in-between space. It's really about what happens in the middle. So if you do it, 1 second, there's not much that happens. If you do it 5 years, maybe some places like maybe nothing happens, but 5 years in some places is a tremendous amount of time. So I think, where I am in the American West, like 100 years is like hardly anything. Like in the Grand Canyon, you maybe one little rock, it's like hard to tell. Like nothing changes because the scale is so vast and the time is so vast. But, in a city, it could be like every year, every 6 months. I mean, who knows? You photograph a construction site, like every day something can happen. So it just depends on what's going on.
The other question is a little bit related to that. Have you ever tried doing videos, mashup videos, so that I think it can happen more in crowded places like cities rather than landscapes. But
I think it would be really interesting to create like a time lapse. I mean, I was thinking that we did this project in the American West that we've done 2 pictures, so there's 3 pictures now. Could continue. I mean, you could really create it might take thousands of years, but you could create this video of the change, of a long-term change. But if you were to do it, like say a construction site or something, you might even do it with a video camera, that's set to take so many frames. And I think that would be very interesting,
I was actually asking video within a video rather than a time-lapse of the whole scene. So having a running video and then retake the same video and putting another frame there.
Just have a running video, That would be, it could be a long watch. That was the Andy Warhol thing, right? I mean, the guy's sleeping and Okay.
Okay, so I think with that then, I think it's lunch.
Okay.
Pretty much.
Well,
so
thanks very much.
Thank you very much again. Thank you. Actually, for the people that are doing the workshop this afternoon, we'll be in the multi-purpose space at 2 o'clock. Okay? 2 o'clock. So please bring your cameras, please bring your laptops, you can have it with you. If there are still anybody in here that would like to take part in this workshop, please come see me now. The workshop is a 4-day workshop starting this afternoon. But if you come to this workshop, you can be excused from other classes. So it's worth it. So, okay? All right. Thanks.